Great. Now we're in business. Hello, everybody. This is An Chi Lin. I'm GSAS 1995. Today, I'm so happy that I have the honor of introducing Shelley Hawks, who will be sharing with us some of her research on a few of the most amazing artists of the contemporary Chinese arts. And Shelley obtained her undergraduate degree at Dartmouth College, earned her master's degree in regional studies, East Asia at Harvard University. Yeah. And then her doctorate at Brown University, which is also very great in Chinese history and arts. And before college, and then before college teaching, Shelley coordinated a large exhibit of oil paintings from China in 1987 and worked in the Asiatic department of the Museum of Fine Art of Boston from 1987 to 89. Previously, she taught at Rhode Island School of Design, Boston University, the University of Massachusetts, and UMass Boston at Mount Holyoke College. And currently, she teaches at the Humanities at the Middlesex Community College in Massachusetts. So without further ado, let's welcome Shelley for what she has to share with us.
Thank you so much, Anchi. I've really enjoyed getting to know Anchi over the course of this, organizing this series. We had some of the same professors at Harvard. So welcome everyone, welcome to the Harvard community and old and new friends. Bear with me for a minute, I'm going to share my screen, and my presentation tonight will be about 35 minutes and it will be a slide presentation. Okay, Anchi, is everything okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Let me move this over here. Okay, so this evening I'll share stories of artists who kept their humanity despite some very dark times. In their paintings of animals, birds, flowers, and trees, China's ancient philosophies are revealed. Chinese ink painting combines poetry, calligraphy, and brushwork, and it was very prestigious among intellectuals for centuries. Yet starting in the 20th century, many saw Chinese painting as outdated and inferior to Western art. But the artists all introduced felt that it still had a future. It just needed some fresh ingredients. One artist described Chinese painting as like a valuable pearl covered in dust. But first, let's set the stage by describing the dark times, the Cultural Revolution, and the mob violence which hit a fever pitch during the late 1960s. This image shows a revolutionary youth destroying objects associated with religion or capitalism. And this kind of destruction was actually happening all over China under the slogan, "Smash the old world, establish the new world." And in this poster, under his big boot, under his big shoe, we see a crucifix, we see a Buddha, books, record albums, dice. Now, Mao blamed traditional culture and capitalism for making China weak. There was an intense cult around Mao's words and images. With pamphlets such as this one, Mao drew many young followers. I collected this pamphlet during my research trips to China in the 1990s. From its slogan, you get an idea for the intensity of the political language. Its caption reads, "Follow closely Chairman Mao's magnificent strategic plan. Chairman Mao says, concern yourself with national affairs and advance the great proletarian cultural revolution to the fullest degree." So what does the fullest degree mean? Well, it sometimes meant beating people to death. Mao felt that the revolutionary spirit needed rekindling. Anyone who stood in the way needed to be struggled against. Among the targets of the Cultural Revolution were professional artists who had been supported with government salaries during the early years of communist rule. But now Mao's mood changed. He felt threatened by trends towards liberalization. And in the violence which followed, millions of people died. Artists were separated from their families, jailed within the art schools, and sent to labor in the countryside. The suffering was terrible, but I'd like to focus on some artists who responded with dignity and grace and even humor. They took risks to paint secretly. And I like to say that they saved art and art saved them. So I began learning Chinese in the 1980s in the master's program at Harvard, and first went to China in 1985. And I made 6 trips after that, collecting materials and interviewing artists. This took more than 20 years. Before I earned my PhD in the 90s at Brown, I worked at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, where I became aware of this landscape painting, a leaning pine tree weighed down by snow near a plum blossom branch and a snow-covered rock. Now, in Chinese tradition, this theme is called the Three Friends of Winter, and it symbolizes strength in adversity. Confucius admired pine trees for their ability to withstand frigid temperatures. The museum curator told me that this artwork had been painted by candlelight when the artist was forbidden to paint, and the painting was confiscated from his home, and later the museum acquired it. So that injured but resilient pine tree seemed to personify the artist's life experience, and it made me wonder whether there was a subtle art of resistance. And that's how I got the idea for the book. But when I started interviewing in China in 1995, it was very difficult to get Chung Fa to talk to me. In fact, he would not discuss his secret painting at all with me. He had probably been warned not to. So it took some time before I could get any artist to really open up to me. In 2016, with the help of photographer John Burris, whose photograph of a red lotus and a red star I show here, I made videos of my interviews with artists in China, and I put them together in a film called The Lotus and the Red Star. And discussions about the Cultural Revolution on film were still possible then, but I don't believe that that project is feasible right now. And it wasn't obvious at first which painters to focus on, and that took a lot of digging. I considered about 20 different artists, but I decided on 7 for whom I could make the strongest case of an art of resistance. I needed to find surviving artists or artists' families or their students who would share with me the specific context in which certain paintings were created and give me permission to publish the images. There were and still are quite a few fakes published in catalogs, so I limited my scope to only those paintings which had been validated as authentic by the artists' families. Here is a photo of Li Kuran, who painted my book cover. He was a man of few words and rather mild in temperament. From a poor, illiterate family in the countryside, this artist rose to become one of China's most famous painters through hard work and constant practice. The inscription to the painting reads, "The buffalo's nature is tame, but it can be stubborn sometimes." According to people close to the artist, and I interviewed 2 of his students and his son, Li personally identified with the buffalo in his paintings. He used the buffalo to tell his own biography. In this one, painted a few years prior to the Cultural Revolution, the buffalo refuses to be led. It stands its ground. The buffalo is the hero of his paintings and a symbol of his independence. Li Kuran painted the buffalo and the herd boy many times over the course of his life. There is an old Buddhist theme related to buffaloes. The herd boy gradually tames the buffalo, and that is, he puts his mind in order on the journey towards enlightenment. But Chairman Mao gave a new twist to the buffalo theme. Mao said intellectuals must lower their heads constantly, like willing buffalo, and humbly serve the people and the party. For Li to portray the buffalo as stubborn and independent was rare. Typically, under communism, the two were in harmony, with the buffalo completely subordinate. Now, Li named his studio Learn from the Buffalo Studio. See how his calligraphy mirrors the buffalo's horns, tail, and fur. During the Cultural Revolution, when he was not allowed to paint and was limited to writing confessions or copying Mao's writings, Li developed this forceful style of calligraphy based on inscriptions from ancient monuments. Now Li Keqiang has a museum in Beijing dedicated to his memory. His many brushes, all different sizes, and the dishes where he mixed ink and water are laid out on a desk as they would appear during his life. At a Sotheby's auction in 2017, one of Li Keqiang's landscape paintings sold for $15 million US. Although he typically finished paintings in the studio, Li sketched outdoors. He valued close observation of nature, especially the play of natural light. His meticulous attention to how things appear in nature was new to Chinese landscape painting. For centuries, the emphasis had been on imitating a certain master's brushwork or copying from painting manuals. Li enjoyed alternating between painting landscapes and painting figures. When I asked Li's son what his father regarded as his most lasting accomplishment, his son became emotional, and we captured this on film. He said that his father probably evaluated figure paintings as his highest accomplishment. A housekeeper had noticed that when no one was around, Li spent hours studying his old figure paintings, the kind he was no longer allowed to paint and had to keep hidden in a drawer. Had politics allowed him to continue painting in this style, he would have painted more such masterpieces. In this work, painted prior to the Cultural Revolution, notice how he leaves the painting within the painting blank, so that we are left to imagine what they are looking at. Emptiness is a dynamic concept in Chinese art and in the ancient philosophy Taoism. Emptiness is where possibility begins. Here is Li Keqiang, another art professor at the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing. He was a martial arts expert besides being a master ink painter. Like Li Keqiang, whose name sounds familiar and who was his neighbor in Beijing, Keqiang was from a poor family in the countryside. He paid tuition for art school by pulling a rickshaw at night. A rickshaw is a carriage pulled by a human. And in those days, he owned no winter clothing at all. The first photo is of a young Chairman Mao. Li Keqiang and Mao were classmates in 1919. When Li lost his position as art professor in 1950, after communist rule was established, Li wrote Mao a letter in his graceful calligraphy on a long piece of paper. Li knew Mao would be impressed and would possibly remember him from their school days. Li's appeal for justice actually worked. Mao helped him to regain his position in 1950, but Li continued to have political troubles because his bird and flower painting style was not easily made into propaganda, and Li himself was quite outspoken. Here he is painting eagles, his representative subject, a kind of self-reference like the buffaloes were for Li Keqiang. And this small painting of a pair of fish from the 1960s demonstrates Keqiang's vigorous calligraphy. The inscription on the painting points out that a fish's physique is difficult to capture because it's constantly moving. The rapid swishing of the fish resembles the rhythm of his calligraphy. Keqiang had a very animated personality. He enjoyed painting in front of audiences, and for him, painting was very athletic. He was an amateur Peking opera performer on the side, and he saw Chinese painting and opera as related art forms. He viewed the Chinese brush as an extension of his body, like the bow and arrow he holds here during an opera performance. And here's an example of a secret painting Lee did during the Cultural Revolution. One of Lee's art students described Lee's eagles as sadly thinking giants prevented from flying. The eagle's face projects a proud independence and possibly an angry glare at the damage which the Cultural Revolution had inflicted on the country. Other secret paintings from that time express the feeling of fear. Here Lee depicts a crane crouching in the underbrush. Typically in Chinese art, cranes are depicting dancing or flying or singing. Lee's inscription declares that he is the first Chinese painter to depict a crane crouching. In another secret painting, Lee depicted small birds huddled together, seeking shelter from the rain. Li Kuchan passed away in 1983, but his son Li Yan, also an artist, granted me interviews. Li Yan was close to his father and has edited many catalogs of his father's paintings. Li Yan was an art student during the Cultural Revolution and was forced to watch his father being beaten and humiliated. He movingly recounts those memories on my film. So I devoted 3 chapters in my book to this painter, Shelley. He is the only one of the artists I studied who was a Communist Party member and a provincial level art official. He resided in China's interior, the Xi'an area, the region where the communists were headquartered during World War II. And he grew up in a wealthy landlord family, but he ran away from home and joined the communist movement in the 1930s. When he was young, some said Shelley looked like Mao. He had the same dashing sweep of his hair. He really admired Mao in his early years, but his faith in Mao was shaken by the extremely damaging policies Mao unleashed. Here is a famous painting by Shelley, which hangs in the China National Museum on Tiananmen Square in Beijing. It pictures Mao looking out from a cliff, surveying troops during China's civil war against Chiang Kai-shek in the 1940s. Shelley was commissioned to paint it in 1959, which happened to be during the Great Leap Forward movement, Mao's ambitious policy to grow grain and produce steel in one great leap. By then, Mao's policies, although they seemed successful at first, by then they had resulted in severe famine. Shelley disagreed with Mao's policies. I argue that Shelley's treatment of Mao in this painting is ambiguous. One can read it as both celebrating Mao and admonishing Mao for his excesses. A few years after it was displayed, Shelley's painting was criticized and removed from the museum. Accusers said that the painting made Mao seem tiny in that vast landscape and pictured him too close to the edge and with his back turned. Authorities asked Shelley to revise the painting, but the artist refused. In Soviet-influenced art, Mao was typically painted large and facing frontally. Compared to the Soviet style, Shelley's painting does seem to take Mao down several notches. On the other hand, the image of a scholar looking out from a mountaintop was an established theme in landscape painting. To put Mao in this context portrayed him as a philosopher and a visionary. However, Shelley's private notebooks during the Cultural Revolution, shared with me by his family, reveal that Shelley had lost respect for Mao by then. In this diary page, Shelley sketched the infamous Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China, with Mao's face. And in an inscription, he described the emperor's clothes as tattered, his mouth drooling, and his nose running. The persecution Shelley experienced on account of that famous painting had a severe impact on him mentally and physically. He developed schizophrenia and was in an asylum recovering when militants seized and jailed him. After 4 years of harsh treatment, including solitary confinement, Shirley was released to his family in 1970, where surprisingly he began to paint again. The first painting he created after returning from prison is this goddess. First, he painted the goddess in black ink. His family was so happy because it showed that he could still paint despite the trauma. But then he poured red seal paste all over her body, leaving only her face and shoulder visible, as though she were covered in blood or a billowy red cloud. Not long after, he surprised them again when he cut the painting into 2 pieces with scissors. Here I am with his son, Shirgua. The painting is still in 2 separate pieces, which he pushed together for this photo. The painting cannot be dismissed as simply the product of mental illness. Shirley's children believe that he undertook these actions with serious purpose. On the painting, there are many inscriptions, such as the one at the top. It says, "Only socialize with beauty, never marry ugliness." In another inscription, he refers to the goddess as the Eastern Venus de Milo, the famous Greek statue in the Louvre, which has come to symbolize art itself. Venus de Milo is just a fragment, yet she is still considered the epitome of beauty. Shirley's goddess seems to represent an Eastern version of art, reduced to fragments. Here I am with the artist's daughter, Shirdan. She was a teenager during the Cultural Revolution and lived alongside her father, so she was able to share with me many stories, and she too is a painter. Here are some examples of her work: abstract renderings of the lotus flower, a symbol of purity, luminous in the night. Although her style of painting is more contemporary, she says that she inherited something spiritual from her father. She is one of many talented women artists now emerging in China's art field. I wrote about her recently in a book coming out later this year called Crossing Boundaries. Back to her father's paintings. This is the first image in a long scroll by Shirley in 1971. We see a healthy red peony with an insect looking down at it. Raindrops are on its antennae. The flower could represent art, a virtuous person, or a sincere revolutionary. In this next image, if we unroll the scroll a bit further, the insect is chewing on the blossoms, making them look thin and unhealthy. And in this last image of the scroll, the insect has devoured the flower. A red flying insect points a spear at the blackened flower as it lies on the ground. Shirley's calligraphy looks like scratches on a wall. As you can imagine, it was hard to read Shirley's inscriptions, but with the help of some Chinese friends, I deciphered parts of it. It's an outcry of resistance against the persecution of creative people. These are his main messages. The kind ones exist forever. Respect the great inventors. He lists people he admires: philosophers, Zhuangzi, Confucius, Buddha, scientists, Edison, Newton, Franklin, Darwin, artist, Da Vinci, novelist, Hugo, and statesman, Dr. Sun Yat-sen. In this painting, now at the Metropolitan Museum of New York in their collection, Shirley painted 3 pine trees on a cliff, withstanding the winter with its branches outstretched. This painting shows his determination to weather the injustices. Shirley survived the Cultural Revolution, but he died of cancer not long after, in 1982. Another professor from the Central Academy of Fine Art in Beijing, named Huang Yongyu, adds a lighter note to my book. He was playful and humorous even during the darkest days. I interviewed him in 1995 after he moved to Hong Kong, still under British rule at that time. Later, he moved back to Beijing, where he still lives at age 97. Here he stands in front of his lotus painting, holding one of his pipes. During the Cultural Revolution, he carved pipes from deer horn and pig hoofs to give to friends to show solidarity. Sometimes he hid secret notes inside the pipes. He pretended to have a contagious disease so that the militants would leave him alone so he could secretly make art. After he was released from prison in the late 1960s, Huang and his family were moved to a tiny shed in the outskirts of Beijing. The place was so small and dark that authorities presumed Huang could no longer paint. There was no window to the outside. Huang defied his predicament by painting this eternal window, looking out on spring flowers. He hung it on his wall, quote, to increase the fun of living. In 1974, Huang fell into serious trouble when his painting of a winking owl came under suspicion. Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, who championed radicalism and who wanted to succeed her husband as supreme leader, claimed that Huang's owl showed disrespect towards socialism. Huang denied this, saying that the owl was one of his commonly painted subjects. The controversy did not subside until Mao himself intervened, in this case, helping the artist. Mao said he saw nothing wrong with the painting because owls actually do this in nature. Now, Huang did not always joke. Here is his sculpture of an intellectual being struggled against, his head forcibly bowed down, wearing a placard which crosses out his name. It bears the ironic title, Paragon of Virtue. While living in Hong Kong during the 1990s, Huang painted this 5-owl scroll for his friend, the art historian Wan Qingli. They had been jailed together during the Cultural Revolution, but by then they both had successful careers. Wan Qingli confided in Huang that he was exhausted from his academic work as an art historian. Huang told him, "You must change things up. Don't do one thing endlessly. It's not healthy." And then in the middle of the night, Huang painted this scroll for his friend to advise him on how to manage his life. The owl models 5 different attitudes. Sometimes face forward, both eyes open, sometimes close one eye, sometimes both eyes, sometimes turn your back, and sometimes play dead. Now, Juan loved the painting, but he did not know whether he could follow this unusual advice. Huang's calligraphy surrounds the owls on the scroll. The birds themselves look like calligraphy. Here Huang wrote, "Life does not have to be so serious." His calligraphy style reflects this playful spirit. And when I interviewed Wan Qingli, the recipient of the painting in 2016, Wan said he was really touched by Huang's concern for him. And I first met Wan Qingli, the art historian, back in 1995. He was one of the first people to open up with me and to talk candidly about sensitive political subjects. He could speak more freely because he lived in Hong Kong. And when I met him again in 2016, after so many years, he gave me this painting as a memento to celebrate the completion of my Painting by Candlelight project. And on a sad note, he passed away not long after the photo was taken. Here I am in 1995 with Ding Song, another painter and humorist. Ding's political troubles began early. In 1957, he was labeled a rightist. This meant he had to dig ditches in a remote region, apart from his wife and his newborn son, a separation which lasted most of the next 20 years. During the 1960s, Ding was transferred to work on a pig farm, and he was forbidden to pick up a paintbrush. He saw an old woman making sponge sculptures with scissors and decided that at least he could do that because scissors had not been forbidden. So here are some sponge sculptures of a dog, a cat, a rooster on the top row, and on the bottom, the Soviet author Maxim Gorky and two of the Chinese author Lu Xun. In 1976, Ding was allowed to return to Beijing, but his case was still not resolved. He was given the job of janitor at the National Art Gallery. He kept his confidence up by painting self-portraits like this one. He left one side of his face dark as a rebuke to the mistreatment he had experienced. Self-portraits were rare under communism because no one would want to seem individualistic. A self-portrait could only be painted secretly. Before communist rule was established, Ding had been a famous cartoonist. In 1945, he drew this statue of what he ironically called the perfect citizen. Ears stuffed with cash, brain censored, eyes covered, and lips locked. After his case was resolved around 1977, Ding got right back to making edgy cartoons. In this 1987 cartoon, he returns to the same theme he got in trouble for, defending artists against excessive political interference. Another humorist I discuss is Feng Zikai, pictured here with his cat. Both are reading a book. To Feng, children and pets were his heroes. He appreciated their spontaneity and their honesty. The hearts of children had not yet grown callous. Here is one of Feng's trademark works, a young girl setting free a caged bird. Feng Zikai collaborated with his famous teacher, a Buddhist monk, Hongyi Fa, to produce a book of Buddhist-inspired pictures and stories called the Protecting Life Painting Collection. Beginning in 1929, when his teacher turned 50, Feng took a vow to complete a new volume every 10 years for as long as he lived. The purpose of the series was to teach people not to be cruel, not to be callous. This image from the 1949 volume warns against using giant hedge cutters to make all children fit into the same mold. After communist rule was established, Feng could no longer publish his Protecting Life series openly, but he continued to work on it secretly. On this 1967 Cultural Revolution pamphlet titled "Shovel Out the Art World's Revisionist Black Line," Feng is shown at the bottom of the pile, still grasping his Protecting Life book. And as an aside, in 1995, I was able to still collect a lot of these kinds of pamphlets that were for sale at street fairs. Even during the Cultural Revolution, after Feng Zikai had been beaten severely, he managed to produce the final volume to complete the vow to his teacher. Here is one image from the volume he completed secretly in the 1970s. A mother eel is being boiled. She heroically raises her middle section to protect her unborn offspring. The cook who is preparing to eat her does not realize she's pregnant until the eel is cut open. The image urges us to think before squandering a life. Here is the ink painter Pan Tianshou, a famous art educator who sought to preserve Chinese painting and calligraphy by integrating it into the modern art curriculum. During the 20th century, art academies in China had been entirely focused on Western art, but Pan changed that. At the time of the Cultural Revolution, he was president of the National Art Academy at Hangzhou. Pan experimented with many techniques, such as painting with his finger or his fingernail rather than a brush. Notice the exquisite texture of the buffalo's hide and his horns. Pan's designs creatively integrate his inscriptions with the image. In this painting of small birds, he counterbalances the descending ledge of the rock with his inscription on the other side, creating two sides of a triangle. Here is a detail from his last painting before he was jailed. A plum tree encircled in snow under the moonlight. This large ink-drenched painting defied the restriction that ink painters must paint only optimistic propaganda subjects. Pan painted the large paper with his body sprawled on the floor, using his finger and his fingernail. The painting was denounced during the Cultural Revolution and used as evidence to accuse him of counter-revolutionary crimes. It's an immense painting, 6 feet by 5 feet, expressing his refusal to follow the Cultural Revolution. The plum is the first flower to bloom even before spring has arrived, so it leads the other flowers. Pan inscribed it, "Though 10,000 flowers remain quiet, this solitary beauty raises one branch towards spring." After the painting was confiscated from Pan's home, it was marked with a big X through it. And you can still see that painting and the faint X markings on it at the museum at the Hangzhou Academy today. Pan was unjustly accused of being a spy and ridiculed as if he were a vulture, a bird he sometimes painted. Despite his terrible mistreatment, the 70-year-old artist was coping fairly well, even after he was made to serve as the janitor of the Art Academy, where he had been president. But the final blow came one winter morning in January 1969. A former student whom he had mentored and promoted to become professor told Pan to prepare to go to his hometown to be struggled against. Pan was forced to tramp through the snow with a sign on his back claiming he was a spy, that his former student had organized the cruel spectacle, hurt him deeply. During the train ride back to jail, the artist picked up a cigarette wrapper and a pencil stub off the floor, and he wrote a poem on it. The cigarette wrapper with his fine calligraphy is still in the Academy archives. It says on it, "This cage does not feel narrow to me. My mind is as wide as heaven and earth." After this incident, Pan's hair turned completely white, and he died a year later. However, now he is honored by the Chinese government. His paintings are housed in a museum on the campus of the school where he once served as president. I'd like to conclude by saying something about the spiritual qualities of Chinese painting, in which we see the wisdom of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, and even folk traditions come together. Here again is art historian Wan Qingli with his wife. Beside them is a painting that was given to them of a cabbage and a plum blossom branch. Li Kuchan, the painter I showed you who painted eagles and who was skilled at martial arts and Peking opera, he painted this for them as a wedding gift in 1977. That was sort of just as the Cultural Revolution was subsiding. The painting's inscription reads, "Eating cabbage, chewing plum blossoms benefits your mood and renews your qi, or your vital energy." The cabbage and the plum, this simple but nutritious diet, are symbols of an uncorrupted life. Wan Qingli had been jailed together with Kuchan. Through that experience, Wan became close with him, and he was treated like a son afterwards. By painting these two symbols of moral integrity, the white cabbage and the plum, Li suggests that he and Wan had been innocent of accused crimes and wished for Wan and his wife to continue to live a principled life. Knowing this context, we see the spiritual meaning coming through, both the wisdom of pursuing the moral way and the personal warmth of a teacher toward his student. Thank you very much. That's the
Thank you. Thank you, Shelley. That was a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
thank you.
Anyone has any question you'd like to raise? And before that, maybe Christine, you want to share with us the story of your patient? Christine?
Yes, hi. So I had a patient, one of my residents' grandfather was imprisoned during the Cultural Revolution. And her name was Linda Wong. I don't remember his name. It's written in Chinese, so I can't read it. But he had been beaten with a lead pipe and had a huge scar here, pipe that was green and irregular. So I excised it for him and took away the scar, and he made me this beautiful painting of crayfish. And I know there's some symbolism behind the crayfish, but I don't really know what the symbolism is. And it's beautiful ink painting that he made for me. So tell me, what is the symbolism of crayfish?
I'm not quite sure about that. Do you know that, Anchi?
What type of fish is it?
Crayfish?
Crayfish.
Crayfish is what?
Crawdads. Crawdads.
I need to look up what type of
I'm
fish.
sure, yeah, I'm sure it's a probably a wish for prosperity and gratitude, sort of auspicious wishes, but I'm not familiar. Hey, does someone else know? Does someone else want to speak up? Good, yeah. Please.
The crawfish is, I think it's a kind of humiliating. It's a bad word, actually. So someone's just terrible. If you call someone, you can say, is that what you talk about? It look like
Well, they said it was supposed to give me luck. That the crawfish was supposed to give me luck and prosperity.
Crawfish?
Yeah, they look like little shrimp with the tails going up.
Oh, yes.
Okay,
Oh,
okay,
shrimp.
okay.
Yeah. Shrimp painting is very common in China. It's to bring them prosperity and
There's a very famous artist named Chi Bai Shi who was famous for doing shrimp.
Yeah,
Yeah.
shrimp is
And,
considered agile
Yes.
fish, right? And the color, even after bad thing happened to them, they turn red. So it means good. There's a way to get over your bad situation. If it's shrimp, like crawfish, that's what you mean.
Yes, that's what I
think
mean.
get what you mean. Okay, great.
Yeah, I mean, when I dug out a lot of meaning from this painting, but it took me a lot of careful work to do it, reading the inscriptions, interviewing either the artist or someone close to the artist, and then also being familiar with the history of different symbols. But even then, of course, there's room for interpretation. Let's say that.
Great. Anyone else has any questions?
It was a wonderful presentation, by the way. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Christine. I'd be curious which of the artists really grabbed you. Which ones do you think you'll remember more than the others?
Lee. I love Lee.
Which Lee? Lee Karan?
First Lee.
The first Lee? Okay.
I do have a question, Shelley. Some of these artists I have very amazing, did very well in the national auction market. Do you think that helped in some way from for China, or the audience in China that may kind of look at these arts differently due to the auction prices, or is it the other way around? Meaning there's certain value that's truly come through, and that's why the auction prices of some of these artworks are so high.
I think that in general, there is a correlation between those very high values and the very high quality art. I do think so. But it was interesting that Anchi and I, as we got to know each other, we both shared that we love Li Karan too. And we also love a painter named Lin Fengmian, who I didn't speak about today. But so it was just sort of interesting that she and I both had those same two, that we just had a very spiritual feeling about those artists. But there's so many good artists, as you can see, in Chinese culture really values art. And during the Cultural Revolution, when things were reversed, it's like they really hated art, hated a certain kind of art, so such strong feelings. I'd love to hear from Lang Yuan, because she wrote in the chat that she grew up during the Cultural Revolution. Could you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, I came here about 30 years ago. So, and I love, I'm a painter myself.
Oh,
I have never seen, because I always like ink painting. I always look at the beauty, but I have never seen this side of a Chinese art, and you really opened my eyes. And a lot of things you showed, and yeah, I just look at them. I never think the meaning behind what else they could be resistant. They during the Cultural Revolution.
yeah, it's dangerous really to talk about it in some respects. And there was sort of a window of time in the 1990s where it was sort of okay to talk about this, but even now it's too sensitive. It's getting a bit sensitive.
Shelley, do you see that artists, back then until now, is there like a tradition or a hidden group that artists will do this, are still doing this, meaning not openly saying no, but continuously trying to do what they feel that speaks to their heart?
That's a good question. Most of the paintings I've shown you tonight were gifts to friends or students or family members. So I think in those contexts, those are very personal paintings. So they're willing to really invest their souls and their feelings in those kind of paintings, but they're not necessarily the kind of paintings you'll see in a museum exhibition. Or if you do, you'll see just a little bit of information. And even when I went to look at the Sotheby's auction catalog to see Lee Caron's painting and how much it's fetching, I noticed that they often did not translate into English the inscriptions, but they did provide it in Chinese. So, if you go the extra step and you go into the Chinese version of the catalogs, you could get a lot more information.
Yeah, so this is, I'm not sure if this answer, John Seal also has a question. John, your question about the current artists, does that answer your question? Or could you state your question to all of us? John?
Shelley,
Yes.
may I ask a question?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yes, Carolyn. Yes.
Yes, hi, Shelley. Wonderful presentation. As a Southerner or a Midwesterner, tell us the genesis of your interest in Chinese art and Chinese history.
Now this is my aunt, so we're related. She knows I'm from Oklahoma. So, well, I always loved history, but I always studied American history till I got to college, and then I took a course on Chinese history, and I was amazed. And something hit me very deeply inside, and I just sort of followed my curiosity. And, decades later, I still don't feel like I've even gotten into the core of it. It's so complicated, so rich, so interesting.
I'm so glad that you.
I think
Go
it was the 20th century China is especially interesting too, because it's so tumultuous. And this was one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the world, and it faced this crumbling dilemma, and it's still trying to pick up the pieces. But we have so much to learn from their philosophy, that Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism are just so rich and sophisticated.
So just to quickly answer Sheila's question, how to buy this book from Shelley. In our email announcements, there is a little paragraph saying how, right? Contact Shelley, and there's a way to contact her, and there's a way to go through
Yeah.
the
Yes,
book.
I would love to talk with you by email. I will send it to you at cost. To me is $40 and then a $5 shipping. And I'll sign it for you.
Okay, great. Laura, you have a question? You want to?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if Shelley ever felt threatened by the government and how they reacted to her digging up like things about the art during the Cultural Revolution and how she felt about it.
It was sensitive. And, you know, back in the 1990s, there was a sense that Americans had some immunity, kind of. Maybe it was just my perception, but I felt like I could probably go places that maybe some other people couldn't. And also because I wasn't a journalist, I was, you know, a historian, and so I wasn't as threatening as someone that was going to write up an article right away, you know. So, but there were a few instances that were difficult. There was one time where I went in to speak with an artist. I wouldn't always tell them that I was going to speak about the Cultural Revolution with them. And so when it came up with this particular artist that I did want to speak about that, I've never seen such a Chinese person get so angry. Usually they're, my experience, very controlled and not. But this person was very angry at me and I had to leave very quickly. And so that was one time when I felt scared. But and I've since 2016, I don't believe my book is permitted in China. I mean, I'm sure you could pass it through private hands, but it's sensitive enough that I don't think you could sell it in China.
What about the images? Are they available in China on the internet?
I think you can find some. You can find some of them there, yes. But there are a lot of fake paintings on the internet, I've noticed. You know, and even when I was going in 1995 and was interviewing some fellow artists who say they showed me some paintings by Shirley. And then later, Shirley's family said, "Oh no, those were fakes," you know. And then they would show me in their catalog, "This one's a fake. This one's a fake. This one's a." So it was amazing. You know, there's already so many fakes circulating. So it was. I was very lucky that I was able to get to know the families who could really give me, you know, accurate information.
Shelley, looks like there's some interest in knowing more about your new book. When is it coming out? Which publisher? How can we get it?
Well, it's a book that is, I only have one chapter in it, and it's coming out for the State University of New York at Albany, and it's called Crossing Boundaries, and it's about women in Chinese art. You probably noticed that the 7 artists I chose, there was no woman, and I regret that, but it is a male-centered field in China. But today, there really are a lot of prominent women painters in China. And so it's starting to be more well known. So I'm not sure when that's going to come out, probably at the end of this year or next year. But yeah, please look for it.
Okay. Thank you for all the great comments. Whitman Ochie, am I saying it right? You know, thank you for the lovely kind comments and share some of your information. We have time for one more question. Is there anyone wants to ask you one last question?
I'd like to just say one thing. I was in China working at Shanghai No. 9 Hospital in 1987, and people spoke very freely. The Cultural Revolution was still relatively new. It had not gone away. It hadn't been that long since it had passed, and people were speaking very, very freely. And then when I went back in 2016, there was a huge change. People were much more reserved with what they said about me. Now, maybe it's because I didn't have the same relationship. When I was there in 87, I was there for an entire month and I lived there in the dormitories. So people felt a little more comfortable with me.
Mhm.
They did have a car that was owned by the hospital that followed me everywhere I went. because it was supposed to drive me everywhere, but I bought a bicycle instead and drove, and so they drove the car behind me everywhere I went. But in 2016, people wouldn't talk about the Cultural Revolution the way they did in 1987.
Mhm. Yes, that's true. I've noticed that too. Very sensitive now.
Okay, great. I guess we're coming up on time. Thank you all for dialing in, and we want to thank Shelley for this great presentation. Although the path and the journey of these amazing artists may be foreign to us, but I think the struggle, their internal struggle, the choice, the constant choices they have to make to be themselves may not be as foreign to some of us.
Yes.
So we really appreciate, Shelley, you bring your wonderful work to us. And we got a lot of interested folks online. And is it okay for them to contact you via email?
Oh, please.
If they
I'd
have.
love to. I'd love to have contact. Thank you.
Okay, great. That's great. So we're at the time. Thank you all. And most of all, thank you, Shelley. This is a great
Thank you.
presentation. We enjoyed
Thank
it.
you, Anchi. Yeah, goodbye, everybody. Yeah.
Thank you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.